Hi everyone, welcome back. Up next we have Byron Wallace. He's a professor at Northeastern University. He'll be presenting about LLMs for healthcare.
Very good. It's not earned yet. It's preemptive. Cool. So thanks everyone. Thanks to the organizers for putting this together. I really like these regional meetings. I think they're super fun. So, I am Byron Wallace. I work at Northeastern, not too far away, and I'm going to talk about LLMs in the context of healthcare. And in particular, I want to talk about some of the potential that I see for them in this space, and I guess some of the potential risks and how we might mitigate those. This monitor is, here we go. All right. Probably most of you in this room have seen what I might characterize as the hype, although, arguably partially justified, around using LLMs for healthcare, right? So this is, I think, a reasonably representative sample article from the Times talking about how AI chatbots can sort of best physicians at, diagnosing patients, that sort of thing. And, this excitement is not confined to the mainstream media. So the research community has seen a lot of papers come out talking about the various ways in which LLMs encode clinical knowledge, which I do think is genuinely interesting. These things were not trained explicitly for this particular domain, and yet they're able to do things like pass medical exams quite easily, which is kind of interesting. Then you get increasingly strong assertions about, superhuman performance of LLMs with respect to reasoning tasks, clinical reasoning tasks. And that's cool. I think the fact that these models can perform very well on these kind of written medical exams is legitimately very interesting. I'm personally kind of more interested in, slightly more quotidian tasks myself. And in particular, I'm sort of less interested in how well LLMs can ace medical exams, and more interested in how we might be able to use LLMs to aid clinicians at point of care to deliver, better informed treatments. And so I think a good example, and the one that I'll be focusing on today, is trying to use language models as sort of an interface to electronic health records, or EHRs. I think EHRs are sort of this really interesting technology because when they were first introduced, the sort of promise was that these were going to make the practice of healthcare more efficient. But in practice, we didn't really see that. In fact, there's this nice article, kind of depressing, from the New Yorker that I'm highlighting here a few years back now, that's sort of talking about, these EHRs, these electronic health records, have become so bloated and ungainly that they've arguably been sort of counterproductive. And so, one thing that we've been thinking about in collaboration with some folks at Brigham and Women's Hospital is how we might try to use language models as an interface to extract relevant information from and summarize information that's contained within EHRs. Right, and so the basic idea here is that, so that's Jeff on the right there. He's a radiologist, and when he's looking at imaging data, it's often the case that there would be information in the patient's record that would either support or perhaps argue against a particular kind of hypothesized diagnosis that he's thinking about. But he doesn't have time to kind of go through all of the records under the time constraints that he has to operate under. So wouldn't it be nice if, instead of having to kind of file through the very long, very messy patient records, you could just ask, like, hey, Jeff thinks this patient's having some demyelination. Is there any evidence for this in the record? And if you use something like, I think here it was like Mistral, and you just sort of go over the record, it's actually pretty good, right? So you can see how it does well on those exams, because it comes up with these symptoms. It's like, oh yes, the patient has axonal degeneration and numbness and tingling in the arms and legs. And that's all very nice, because those things actually are, it turns out, symptoms of demyelination. The problem is it just made this up, right? So one of the risks here is that, as we all know, models are still prone, miraculous as they are, to these sorts of confabulations or hallucinations. And the trouble is that this kind of undercuts the entire motivation for using them for efficiency in the first place, right? Because if you don't know, the errors that it makes are relatively rare, but when it makes them, it's bad, and you don't know when it's making them. So this is like sort of one issue, just the risk of confabulations. Another issue that I'll highlight as just a risk of using LLMs in this space that we have tried to empirically characterize is the fact that these models are quite sensitive to the way in which you issue prompts. And I would argue that this is particularly problematic in the medical domain because clinicians, people like Jeff, are not seasoned prompt engineers. They are not going to write few-shot examples to perform their tasks, right? But if you ask the same model, in this case, for example, like, what is the risk that this patient, is exhibiting symptoms of alcohol use disorder, right? In two different but equally valid ways, what this plot is showing is that you get wildly different classification results with respect to that assessment, right? And so this is just to say that the models are quite sensitive to the particular arbitrary phrasings of instructions, and I think this is especially problematic for their use in healthcare. So I just wanted to sort of set the table by like highlighting, I guess, these few examples of risks of using this kind of technology in this space. And I think the real issue here is that we don't have a great way of dealing with these problems. And that's because, I know it's a cliche, but it remains mostly true, that the models are sort of black boxes, right? And so if you're going to do something like, I don't know, predict, you want to make some prediction on the basis of EHR, you can do that. You can totally just like run a bunch of EHR for a particular patient through and be like, hey, like what's the risk that this patient is going to be readmitted in 30 days, which is sort of a standard clinical NLP task. And you'll get pretty good performance, but you'll have no idea what informed that prediction. And so I think one of the things I've been thinking about is like, what are the ways in which we could, even if it is a black box, could you still use it in a way that permits certain sorts of interpretability? And I think it's important to always include the scare quotes around interpretability because nobody ever knows what we're talking about when we talk about interpretability. But one thing that you could be talking about, or that might be reasonable to talk about, is good old linear models, right? Where we have some number m of features, maybe that's like, m is like tens or 100, and each of these features then, we're going to associate with just a weight here, theta, and that's it. And in this way, you get these high-level features, and you can inspect the magnitudes and the directions of the weights that you learn for a particular task, like 30-day readmission, and you can sort of sanity check that, right? So the trouble with doing this is that getting the high-level features is often quite hard. So if you think about like clinical predictive tasks, it's often the case that the high-level features that you would like to include in a predictive model are not going to be directly codified in the health records. They're going to be implicitly there in the notes. And so I've actually worked with healthcare systems where they've had staff whose job it is actually to go and extract from unstructured medical records these high-level features that are then put into these predictive models. And this is, of course, not ideal. It doesn't scale, and it's just not a great system. And so one idea, it's very simple, is instead of using the sort of LLMs as black box predictors, use them as black box feature extractors. So basically what you can do is you can actually craft totally sort of custom bespoke features that are predictive for the task that you're interested in. And you can just extract that zero shot from the records, right? And then you can populate in the typical way a feature vector using these features that you extract, right? And so I should say this was work that was led by Jared, who was a former PhD student and has sadly gone to industry, but some people make these kinds of decisions. But it's cool. It's all right. So this is the idea. We can get a little bit fancier, just like very slightly fancier, if instead of using discrete indicators to say like, the model says yes or no that this patient has a history of a chronic illness, you can do something like, well, what I'll do is I'll use the mass that it's assigned to, so the sort of the predicted probability that the output to the template associated with a particular feature n is yes. So the template here, that t sub n, is just like a lot of notation to say that's basically like a prompt, like, is this patient at risk of, does this patient have a history of chronic illness or something like that? And you just divide it through by the mass it assigns to no plus what it assigns to yes. So very simple. So in this way, you can sort of assemble these features, and these are all, I think the important thing to emphasize here is like, this is a toy task that we did for evaluation with our radiologist collaborator. And the key point is that all of these nice things, these are all high-level features that Jeff, the radiologist himself, specified in natural language. And we told him, like, this is the classification task. What are the features that you would use that you'd want to know about a patient? And what you're able to do, right, is inspect the way. This is not interesting except insofar as the features are sort of custom, right? But otherwise, like, this is standard linear model stuff. You can inspect the direction and the magnitudes of the coefficients that you learn for each feature. And in this way, you can kind of sanity check them. And that's what the X's and the checks are here. Jeff went through and was like, yeah, this makes sense. This like agrees with my a priori domain knowledge, basically. And so this is nice. You can sort of do this model debugging thing. And you can also do sort of data debugging. So this is just an example of a case where the model predicted that this chest X-ray report had evidence of an edema, and that was not in the label set in the Chexpert data set that we were using. And we showed the top sort of most important features, these high-level features that the radiologist had specified for this particular input. And on inspection, it turned out that the label was wrong, actually. So this is, these kinds of things is what you can do when you specify linear models that are using high-level features extracted automatically. So that's one thing. That's like sort of one idea about maybe how we can build predictive models in this space using LLMs, but having some sort of interpretability. It's a little bit of a weird compromise because there is this caveat that it's only interpretable insofar as you believe the LLM is extracting the feature you've asked it to. That's a whole kind of conversation, but I think it might be an interesting way forward. Another set of risks that I'll sort of pivot to now concerns bias, right? So I think it's pretty obvious to all of us that these models exhibit all sorts of problematic biases. Of course, this is another term that's difficult to define, but I think in medicine in particular, we're very nervous about these sorts of things because it's well documented that there are serious disparities in the delivery of healthcare in this country, and LLMs might exacerbate this. And so there's been a bunch of work on this. I'm going to focus for the moment on this particular task that was introduced in a somewhat recent work published in the Lancet Digital Health. And this was looking at GPT-4 and its propensity to kind of perpetuate racial and gender biases in healthcare. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce this task to try and make the case for using interpretability tools to, I guess, investigate these kinds of behaviors. And this is sort of a preliminary effort to do that. Okay, so this task is kind of a toy task. What we're going to do is we're going to ask GPT-4 to compose a brief presentation of a patient presenting with a particular disease, so like coronary artery disease. And, of course, GPT-4 will happily do this. In this case, it gives you a 65-year-old, and it's assigned a gender of female to this person, and, it's a reasonable vignette. And this is not our work, but what the previous work found in this Lancet paper was that GPT-4 is aware of the fact that some conditions are overrepresented in some demographic groups. So some conditions are more commonly experienced by females or by black individuals, that kind of thing. But GPT-4 actually not only doesn't know, but it exaggerates those associations, right? So just to zoom in on one of them. So if you look at like sarcoidosis, GPT-4 overestimates the prevalence of sarcoidosis for black and female individuals in a way that's beyond what the actual empirical prevalence is. So we're going to take this task, and this was work led by Hiba, who is here today. You can chat with her. Also in collaboration with Arnab, who's a PhD student of David's, with Silvio, a colleague of mine, and David, who's here, ready to, I don't know, hector me or something. So the idea here is to use sort of activation patching as a first attempt to see if we can localize and ultimately manipulate the implicit representation of patient demographic information when LLMs are processing or performing clinical NLP tasks. Right? And so the first thing that we did, so obviously we can't use GPT-4 for this, so we're going to use Olmo. And the first thing that we did was reproduce a subset of the results from that Lancet paper with Olmo. And it turns out that Olmo actually exaggerates these associations even more. So if you ask Olmo to generate a vignette of a patient with sarcoidosis, it will give you a female back 98% of the time. The true prevalence is like 64%, just to give you a sense, right? And so the question is, can we control this? And can we localize where this information is, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a source prompt. In this case, it's very simple. We'll start with just a prompt, the patient is male. And we have our vignette generation prompt, which is compose a brief presentation of a patient with sarcoidosis. And we're going to search over, is standard activation patching. We're just going to search over layers, and we're going to search over token positions, and we're going to look at the NLP activations, and we're going to figure out where to patch in. We're going to look at what happens when we patch in activations from the source prompt to the vignette generation prompt, the target prompt. And each time we do this, we can calculate this rewrite score, and the rewrite score is basically measuring in the generated prompt subsequently under the intervention, how much mass do we assign to the male token in the generated vignette minus what we assign to the male token in the unadulterated case. So for the target prompt, that's just sarcoidosis with no intervention. And then we'll sort of scale this by a term that basically says this would be the maximum that you could hope to that you would hope to change the output to male, right? So here we're patching in these male activations, and the idea is to see the degree to which that's reflected in the generated vignette. And you can build, using this rewrite score, you can sort of build these kinds of heat maps. And what this is saying is that for this particular task, the sort of maleness, I guess, seems to be coded for pretty locally in layer 18 and on the last subtoken of whatever the condition is. So the last token of sarcoidosis, right? And so this is sort of interesting. So what you can do is you can go ahead and patch that in, right? So this is the general prompt. In this case, we're doing MS, also over-associated with females. And if you just do the vanilla thing, it's oh yeah, Sarah Johnson, 42, has MS. If you intervene and you just patch in these activations at that particular layer, it'll happily give you back a different vignette. Now it's John Smith. It's a male, but still has MS and largely otherwise unmodified. So this is very consistent across both MS and sarcoidosis. For whatever reason, we have to scale the patch up for MS just a bit for it to work. But once you do this, it will flip the gender in the generated vignette 100% of the time. So it really seems to be localized right there. Now, the source prompt there was this very simple, very the patient is male thing. We were sort of interested in if there's an implicit representation of gender when you don't state it explicitly. And so one thing that we did as well is we took as our source prompt a prompt talking about prostate cancer. And then we take the patch now from the last token of prostate cancer, and we patch that into the MS prompt, for example. And what you might think is that it would generate stuff about prostate cancer, but it doesn't do that. It actually will still generate stuff about MS or sarcoidosis or whatever it is that you're looking, but it will flip the gender consistently. You do have to scale it up by 2, I guess, but it still happens. So it's kind of interesting. It is sort of there is this implicit encoding of gender, it seems, and that's true even when it's only implicit through a sort of a very gendered condition or a really sexed condition like prostate cancer. For race, which we also looked at, it's more complicated. So the information seems more distributed across layers, although you can still do it to an extent. This is flipping from Asian to Caucasian. Olmo 2 overrepresents Asians for hepatitis B, for example. So there are multiple layers in play here. It's less, the sort of effect is less localized, it seems, but there's still some of that. So it's a bit more complicated in general. Right, so all this plot is showing is that for different race groups, when you try to flip to that race, you can do so somewhat consistently, but not 100% like we could do with gender, and also it requires scaling, basically, is what this is saying. And you can do it at different layers, although 4 seems to be a little bit better. Cool. So these were just for vignette generation. Vignette generation is a toy task. We're really interested in the downstream implications of this kind of implicit representation of demographic information. So one thing that we looked at was predicting clinical depression. So it turns out that it is the case that clinical depression is more commonly diagnosed, at least in female and black patients. And so what we did was we took a bunch of brief hospital courses that had been shared by a different group, and we removed all explicit mentions of gender and race from these reports. And then what we did was we elicited a risk of depression prediction from Olmo after assigning implicitly via patching one of the demographic categories. Like we patch in like a male activation, for example, or a female activation, right? Or black or white. And so, so the way that this works is we say, okay, here's a hospital course of a patient. Based on this course, is the patient at risk of depression, right? And in this case, we patch in the demographic category at the last token of the last token of the prompt. And what we find is that doing this results in the model making predictions that align with sort of the sort of biases that you would anticipate. So it does indeed predict, when you do this via patching, it does translate to higher prediction rates for depression for female and black patients. And so this is showing the delta. And so basically, on average, it's it's more likely to assign females, to say that females are at risk of depression than males, and that black patients are than white patients. And that's, just via patching, right? So this is kind of an interesting downstream phenomenon. And to give you a sense, like this is the qualitative outputs, right? So if you patch in the male, it's like, oh, there's no direct indication that the patient is at risk of depression. If you patch in the female activations for the same instance, it's like, oh yeah, the patient's history of anxiety and alcohol withdrawal symptoms, as well as her eviction from her apartment, suggests that she might be at risk of depression, right? So it's kind of interesting to sort of, spot check these. Okay, so that's it. I think I should have time for questions and everything. So I think I'll just sort of wrap up. Like this was like an initial foray at trying to look at a few different kinds of interpretability for healthcare. And I would encourage. It seems like many people here are doing very cool things on interpretability. And I think maybe it's a completely valid and incredibly interesting scientific aim to just want to understand LLMs for the sake of doing it. So I think that's totally cool. But I think it's also useful and a complementary perspective to think about, like, what can we do with these things, and like who are we building them for? And maybe that will help motivate certain abstractions over others. So that's like the last thing I'd say. Okay, that's it. Thanks to all the collaborators on this stuff, and thanks for having me. And I'll take any questions.
So we do have time for a couple of questions.
Okay, thank you so much for the great talk. I have questions about the first part of the talk, whether you talk about feature extraction to build linear models. I think you briefly touched on, but didn't get into details. So basically, my question is that if you're going to extract these features, how are these features different from the original label you're going to predict? And another thing is that if you assume that later on the linear model can work well, that's like saying this extracted feature, they have a linear relationship with the final model. If you don't have domain experts like physicians to help you, how do you know these features in the first place? Thank you so much.
Great questions. Am I off? Yeah, okay. So the first question I think was, how do you know, basically, like, what's the difference between, why don't you just extract the thing that you're trying to predict, basically? Yeah, it's a really good question. My view on this is you can, of course, just ask, like, what's the risk that this patient is going to be readmitted in 30 days? And you could, like, insert that as a zero-shot feature and then, like, have, like, this totally trivial model. My thing is, I think you have to be careful about designing the features. So what I would say is what you really want to do is have features that are verifiable. So features that don't require prediction, but are about actually inferring stuff about, for example, the patient that you legitimately could infer from the record, as opposed to making predictions on the basis of information in the record, if that makes sense. So it's really just like how you do the model building. And that, I think, sort of is related to your second question, which is, how do you build these features if you don't have a domain expert? And I guess I feel like you don't. Like, right? Like, I guess I feel like to to me, the advantage is allowing domain experts to provide the sort of domain relevant expertise in terms of model building, and then using LLMs to build the model, right, based on that expertise. So this is like, I guess I would view this as like trying to codify existing domain knowledge and trying to operationalize that into a predictive model that sort of yields some sort of interpretability, right? But that would be my take. You could imagine trying to do other things. Like you could imagine like trying to get LLMs to themselves specify the features that might correlate and then like doing zero-shot extraction of those. But that's, that gets a little bit weirder. But does that make sense? Thanks.
Yeah, well.
Sure.
Thanks. Yeah, really great talk. So when you use like language models as feature extractors and you're talking about a very specific domain, you prefaced it with this fact that there is a lot of uncertainty, right? Like there's so much of the opposite of robustness, right? Like it just completely changes what the outcome is if it is going to be a much high-level decision such as diagnosis, but you're kind of like breaking it down into like, let me see if this person is exhibiting this behavior which correlates to something like some symptom that they had shown. That by in itself could be quite complex, right? For example, the clinician or the physician is interested to know if this person probably has their lungs have been affected, right? Could be from smoking or it could be from the place they are surrounded, the pollution effects, it could be. So there is actually an inference step going on. You see what I'm getting at? There's a circular issue here that even that could be systematically be affected by how you're phrasing it, what kind of inference strategy it actually uses, right?
Yeah. So I think the astute audience member will pick up on the fact that I complained about them being very sensitive to zero-shot prompts, and then I said, but we have some template for doing feature extraction, and we trust that kind of works okay. And I think you're also pointing out that the features themselves are quite complex, and there's a fair amount of inference that might have to go into them. That kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier. I totally agree with you. I sort of feel like there's like a number of things that you have to think through if you're going to actually do this. And I think that one of them, in my view, would be like you probably don't want features that require a lot of inference. And of course, that's very subjective and it's a little touchy-feely. But I guess I feel like that's where the domain experts come in. Is like I guess it gets back to the other question. Like for the zero-shot feature extraction stuff, if you want it for interpretability, I would say what you want to do is specify features that are relatively straightforward and derivable from the sort of patient record itself in a way that, and again, I agree, I don't have a really super concrete definition here because it gets slippery because like some inference is probably going to be involved.
Right.
But like you want the inference to be like trivial and not predictive, I guess. That would be my take. But honestly, I don't have great answers for this.
Yeah. This is at the level things are right now. As its inference gets better and better, you would hope that
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's weird because you're trying to like, I agree that it's like a hybrid thing where it's like, well, do you trust the individual feature extractions to begin with? And I don't know, kind of, maybe. But it's a sort of interpretability, maybe. You always need the scare quotes.
Cool. Thanks.
All right. Maybe the next questions could be offline because we're running out of time. Let's thank Byron again.
Thank you.